Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to two new members of our Patreon family, Janet and William. Thank you both so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener-supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and helping us continue to make new episodes week after week, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. In honor of the new discoveries being made by NASA's latest telescope, let's return to Astronomy for Young Folks by Isabel Martin Lewis, A.M., connected with the Nautical Almanac Office of the U.S. Naval Observatory. Published in 1922 by Duffield & Company, New York. Let's pick up with this marvelous book right where we left off. Chapter 19, Jupiter and His 9 Moons. Let's begin. Jupiter shines by reflected sunlight with a brilliancy that usually exceeds that of the brightest of the stars, Sirius. When seen during the midnight hours, the remarkable unflickering brightness of this largest and most distinguished member of the solar system at once serves to set it apart from the scintillating stars far beyond. There is but one planet, Venus, that always surpasses Jupiter in brilliancy, though Mars on the occasions of its close approaches to the Earth may equal or slightly surpass Jupiter in brightness. As Venus never departs more than 48 degrees from the Sun, and so is never seen in the midnight hours, Jupiter usually shines without a rival when visible at midnight. To one who has observed the two planets together, the silvery radiance and surpassing brilliancy of Venus, due not to its size, but to its comparative nearness to the Earth, at once serves to distinguish it from the golden glow of Jupiter. Even the smallest telescopes of 2 or 3 inch aperture will show the 4 historic moons of Jupiter, which were the first celestial objects to be discovered when Galileo turned his crude telescope to the heavens in the year 1610. The fact that these tiny points of light were actually revolving around the great planet was soon detected by the famous astronomer, and we can imagine with what breathless interest he observed these satellites of another world, whose discovery dealt such a severe blow to the old Ptolemaic theory that the Earth was the center of the universe. It was not until the great telescopes of modern times were invented that the 5 additional moons of Jupiter were discovered. The 4 satellites first observed by Galileo were fancifully named Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, in the order of their positions outward from the planet. but these names are rarely used now, the satellites being designated for convenience 1, 2, 3, and 4, respectively. The first of the new satellites to be discovered was Satellite 5, which is the nearest to Jupiter of all the 9 moons. It is an extremely small body, not more than 100 miles in diameter, and to discover this tiny body as it skirted rapidly around the great planet with 67,000 miles of its surface nearly lost in the glaring rays was a difficult feat even for an experienced observer. It was accomplished, however, by Professor E. Barnard with the great Lick refractor in 1892. Satellite 5 is hopelessly beyond the reach of any but the greatest telescopes, as are also the 4 satellites discovered since that date. In fact, most of these tiny moons are observed photographically. Satellites 6 and 7 were discovered photographically in 1905. They are both about 7 million miles from the planet, and their paths loop through one another. They are, moreover, highly inclined to each other at an angle of nearly 30 degrees. When nearest together, they are separated by a distance of 2 million miles. 2 more extremely small bodies, known as satellites 8 and 9, have been discovered since then, one at Greenwich, England in 1908, the other at the Lick Observatory in 1914. These excessively faint bodies are the most remote satellites of Jupiter, and they are of particular interest because they travel around the planet in a retrograde direction, or from east to west, which is opposite to the direction of revolution prevailing in the solar system. The 9th and most distant satellite of Saturn also retrogrades, or revolves in a clockwise rather than a counterclockwise direction around the planet. One explanation given for this peculiarity of the outermost satellites of Jupiter and Saturn is that this backward revolution around the planet is more stable when the satellites are at great distances from the primary, and the gravitational control that the planet exerts is therefore weak. The moons of the planets are, of course, subject to the attraction of the Sun, as well as to the attraction of the controlling planet, and the greater the distance of the satellite from the planet, the stronger the pull exerted by the Sun, and the weaker the bonds that bind the moon to the planet. Beyond a certain limit, it would be impossible for the planet to hold the satellite against the Sun's greater attraction, and the satellite would leave the planet to revolve directly around the Sun, thereby becoming a planet. It appears that as this danger limit is neared, it is safer for the satellite to back around the planet than to follow the usual west to east direction of revolution. The 8th satellite of Jupiter is more than 14 million, and the 9th more than 15 million miles from the parent planet, and they require about 2 years and 3 years respectively to complete one trip around Jupiter. When we consider that Satellite 5 darts around the planet in less than 12 hours, at a distance of only 67,000 miles from its surface, we realize what tremendous differences exist in the distances and periods of revolution of the 9 moons. There is also great disparity in the sizes of the various moons. The 5 moons discovered in modern times are all excessively faint and extremely small. The diameter of the largest of these, Satellite 5, is less than 100 miles. On the other hand, the 4 historic moons of Jupiter are of planetary dimensions. The smallest, Satellite 2, is slightly larger than our own moon, while the largest, Satellite 3, has a diameter, according to measurements made with the 40-inch Yerkes refractor in 1916, of 3,908 miles, which is only 400 miles less than the diameter of Mars. The periods of revolution of these 4 satellites range from 1 day and 18 hours for the nearest, which is about 261,000 miles from the center of Jupiter, to 16 days and 16½ hours for the most distant, which is more than 1,160,000 miles from the planet. These 4 moons are so near to the great planet that they are continually dipping into his huge shadow and experiencing an eclipse of the sun, which, owing to the nearness and great size of Jupiter, lasts for 2 or 3 hours. At times of eclipse, the moon suddenly disappears from the observer's view, though it may be considerably to one side of the planet. Its reappearance later on is just as sudden, or it may pass out of the shadow while hidden from us behind the disk of the planet, in which case its reappearance is invisible from the Earth. The occultations of the satellites, or in other words, their disappearance behind the planet's disk, are also interesting phenomena to observe, as are their transits across the disk of the planet as the satellite passes in front of it. Not only the satellite itself, but its shadow as well can be seen, a small black dot passing over the surface of Jupiter. The satellite is totally eclipsing the sun for this small dark portion of the planet's disk. 2 satellites and their shadows are frequently seen crossing the face of the planet at the same time. It is possible to observe all the phenomena of the satellite's transits and shadows, eclipses and occultations with very small telescopes. From observations of the eclipses of Jupiter's satellites, the important discovery of the finite velocity of light was first made as far back as the year 1675. Faint surface markings have been made out at certain times on the largest of the 4 satellites, Satellite 3, and also on Satellite 1. Observations of the markings on the former seem to indicate that it always keeps the same face turned toward Jupiter, as does our own moon toward the Earth. There are also reasons for believing that the equatorial regions of Satellite 1 are light-colored and the polar regions dark. There is the possibility that forms of life may exist on these satellites of Jupiter, though they are more likely barren, lifeless worlds, such as Mercury and the Moon. Their great distance from the Earth, never less than 368 million miles, make observations of their surface markings very difficult. How beautiful beyond description must the heavens appear as viewed from the satellites of Jupiter. Viewed from the distance of Io or Satellite 1, the mighty planet Jupiter presents a spectacle such as the eye of man has never been privileged to behold. The huge flattened globe, 90,000 miles in equatorial diameter, equal in mass to 300 planets such as our own, and in volume to nearly 1,400, fills a space in the heavens nearly 20 degrees in extent as viewed from this satellite. 1,500 of our own full moons would hardly fill the same space. whirling on its axis with frightful speed. In a period of less than 10 hours, the huge ball glides rapidly but majestically onward through the sky. A far distant sun, shrunk to but 1/5 the diameter of the full moon, throws light and shade across the rapidly changing surface of the planet, rich in the reds, browns, and yellows, and all the gorgeous shades and tints of its dense, seething, gaseous envelope. The phases of the moon on a greatly enlarged scale rapidly succeed each other on Jupiter, as it is viewed from the satellite in all positions with reference to the sun. The cause of the belts of Jupiter that lie parallel to the planet's equator and are constantly changing in number, width, and shade, as well as the nature of all the peculiar splashes of color and intensely white flecks that come and go in the dense atmosphere of the planet, would not be such a mystery to us were it possible to view the great planet from the distance of Satellite 1, which is about as far from the surface of Jupiter as the moon is from the earth. It is uncertain whether the planet is entirely gaseous throughout, or has a central core of solid or liquid matter. Its density is only 1 1/4 times that of water, and slightly less than that of the sun, showing that it is composed largely, if not entirely, of matter in a gaseous state. Jupiter is a world as different from our own as it is possible to imagine. There is no visible surface crust, and there are no permanent markings. Different spots on the planet's disk give different periods of rotation, showing that it is atmospheric phenomena that we observe. All is constant flux and change on Jupiter. Dense vapors arise from a highly heated interior and spread out into belts parallel to the equator in the direction of the planet's rotation. From its nearest satellite, all the interesting changes of color and form that constantly take place in the atmosphere of this great globe could be observed in great detail. The high percentage of light and heat that Jupiter reflects from the sun to its nearer satellites makes it a secondary sun to them of tremendous size, though feeble strength. As seen from Satellite 1, the other 3 major moons of Jupiter present all the phases of our own moon in rapid succession, due to their constantly changing positions with reference to the sun. The 5 small moons, discovered in modern times, are so minute that they are simply star-like points of light, even when viewed from the other moons of Jupiter. To keep track of the rapidly changing positions and various phases of the moons of Jupiter, as seen from any one of them, as well as the rapid apparent motion of the planet through the sky, due to the revolutions of the satellite around the planet, would be a troublesome task for an astronomer stationed on one of these far distant worlds. It would be a common sight to see in the sky at one time the huge planet, the far distant shrunken sun, and 1, 2, or 3 moons. Seen from the moons of Jupiter, the constellations would appear as they do to us on Earth, for such a slight change in position as 500 million miles, more or less, is trivial when one is looking at the stars. Observations of the stars from the nearest moon of Jupiter would be attended with great difficulties at times, since reflected sunlight from a body nearly 20 degrees in diameter would be extremely troublesome, especially were the phases of the planets near that of the full moon. We know how the presence of our own moon in the heavens at the full dims the brightness of the stars so that only the brightest stars are seen. Even as viewed from the fourth or most distant of the major satellites, the planet subtends an angle of nearly 5 degrees. Occultations of the stars are many and frequent as the huge planet globe glides swiftly through the heavens. Many a moonlit night appears almost as day, owing to the presence of the enormous, brilliantly reflecting ball of light, and at times 2 or 3 moons in addition. Only the brightest stars could possibly be seen under such circumstances. When, however, the small worlds pass into the shadow of the great mother planet, and not only the light of the sun, but also the reflected light of Jupiter disappears for many minutes, the stars shine forth in all their glory there as here. At such times, some of the larger moons would usually be seen shining by the reflected light of the far distant sun. Saturn also would be visible as a magnificent star. But beautiful Venus and ruddy Mars would fail to appear. Tiny bodies, mere specks of light at this distance, they would be lost to view in the glare of the sun. Chapter 20. The Rings and Moons of Saturn. Nearly everyone has felt at some time or other a strong desire to gaze at some of the beauties and wonders of the heavens through a telescope, and the one object that all of us wish to see, if perchance this desire is to be gratified, is Saturn, whose unusual ring system has, so far as we know, no counterpart in the sky. All the planets in the solar system, with the exception of the 2 innermost, Mercury and Venus, are attended by satellites, but Saturn alone has, in addition to a family of 9 moons, 3 distinct rings of great dimensions, which are composed of swarms of minute particles revolving around the planet. Why Saturn should be the only planet to possess such a system of rings has never been explained in an entirely satisfactory manner. There is an interesting law, known as Roche's law, however, named from its investigator, that states that no satellite of a planet can exist intact within 2.44 times the radius of the planet. This limit is spoken of as Roche's limit, and applying it to the planet Saturn, we find that the rings of Saturn fall within this limit. It does not necessarily follow from this that the minute particles of which the rings are composed are the shattered remains of one small satellite, but rather that they are the material from which a satellite might have been formed were it not so close to the planet. Within Roche's limit, the mutual attraction of the various particles for each other that would tend eventually to gather them into one body is overcome by tidal forces that arise from such close proximity to the huge planet. The stress and strain of such forces is so great that no grouping of particles can take place. This explains possibly why the rings continue to exist in their present condition. The total quantity of matter in the rings is known to be very small, for it does not disturb the motions of any of the nearer and smaller satellites, though tiny Mimas, 600 miles in diameter, is only 31,000 miles beyond the outer edge of the outer ring. An interesting observation was made a few years ago of the passage of the rings of the planet between us and a star. Though the light of the star was diminished to 1/4 of its normal brightness when the rings passed before it, At no time was its light entirely eclipsed by any of the particles. It was computed that if the diameters of any of the individual particles had amounted to as much as 3 or 4 miles, the star would have been temporarily eclipsed. An upper limit for the size of the moonlets was thus obtained. The average diameter of the particles is probably much less than 3 miles. The thickness of the ring system is not over 50 or 100 miles, but its total diameter is 172,000 miles. There are in all 3 concentric rings. The faint inner ring, known as the crepe ring, is invisible in a telescope under 4 inches in aperture. The width of this inner ring is 11,000 miles. Just beyond the crepe ring is the chief bright ring, 18,000 miles in width. It shades gradually in brightness from its juncture with the crepe ring to its most luminous portion at its outer edge, which is separated from the third or outer ring by a gap of 2,200 miles in width, known as Cassini's division. The third or outer ring is 11,000 miles wide and is less bright than the central ring. The inner edge of the inner ring is but 6,000 miles above the surface of the planet. On account of the curvature of the planet, the ring system is invisible from the north and south poles of Saturn. As in the case of the satellites of a planet, the inner particles of the rings revolve around the planet more rapidly than the outer particles. The innermost particles of the crepe ring require but 5 hours for one journey around Saturn, while the outermost particles of the outer ring require 137 hours, or nearly 6 days, to complete one revolution. In addition to the gap in the rings known as Cassini's division, several other fainter divisions exist. If a group of moonlets were to revolve around the planet in the positions marked by these gaps, their periods of revolution would be commensurable with the periods of several of the satellites of Saturn. As a result, the attraction exerted on such particles by these satellites would gradually disturb their motion in such a way as to draw them away from these positions. It is owing, therefore, to the attraction of the satellites of Saturn for these moonlets that these gaps in the rings exist. As a result of the disturbances produced in the motion of the moonlets by the satellites of Saturn, collisions are bound to occur occasionally among the various particles. When 2 particles collide, the period of revolution of one or both of them is reduced, and as a result, collisions tend to bring the moonlets gradually closer and closer to the surface of the planet. The dusky inner ring, it is believed, may consist largely of particles whose periods have been continually shortened by collisions. Saturn may, therefore, lose its ring system in the course of time through its gradually being drawn down upon the planet by collisions of the various particles, until all of the material is finally swept up by the planet. Such a change would probably require millions of years, however, as collisions are probably on the whole infrequent. It is possible that the ring system of Saturn may have been much more extensive in the past than it is now, and other members of our solar system may have had such appendages in the far distant past. The appearance of the rings of Saturn as viewed from our planet changes periodically as a result of the revolution of the Earth and Saturn around the Sun, which places them in constantly changing positions with reference to each other. The rings lie in the plane of Saturn's equator, which is inclined 27 degrees to its orbit and 28 degrees to the Earth's orbit. Since the position of the equator remains parallel to itself while the planet is journeying around the Sun, it happens that half the time the Earth is elevated above the plane of the rings, and the remainder of the time it lies below the plane of the rings. Twice in the period of Saturn's revolution around the Sun, which occupies nearly 30 years, the Earth lies directly in the plane of the rings, and at this time the rings entirely disappear from view for a short time. Midway between the two dates of disappearance, the rings are tilted at their widest angle with reference to the Earth, and they are then seen to the best advantage. As the date of their disappearance approaches, they appear more and more like a line of light extending to either side of the planet's equator. Even in the most powerful telescope, the rings entirely disappear from view for a few hours at the time the Earth lies exactly in the same plane. It is at this time that the ball of the planet is best seen. Its flattening at the poles, which is nearly 10% of its equatorial diameter, then gives it a decidedly oval appearance. Ordinarily, one of the hemispheres of Saturn is partly or entirely concealed by the rings, so that the oblate form is not so noticeable. It was the change in the tilt and visibility of the rings that so perplexed Galileo when he attempted to make out the nature of these appendages of Saturn with his crude telescope of insufficient magnifying power. So great was his bewilderment when the rings finally disappeared that he cried out in despair that Saturn must have swallowed his children according to the legend. He finally became so exasperated with the results of his observations that he gave up observing the planet. The true nature of these appendages of Saturn remained a mystery until Huygens solved the problem in 1655, some time after the death of Galileo. In addition to the rings, Saturn has 9 satellites, named in order of their distance outward from the planet: Mimas, Enceladus, Tethys, Dione, Rhea, Titan, Hyperion, Iapetus, and Phoebe. The last mentioned satellite was discovered by W.H. Pickering in 1899. It aroused great interest at the time because it was the first satellite to be discovered with retrograde motion in its orbit. 2 satellites of Jupiter since discovered revolve in the same direction around their primary. The satellites of Saturn are approximate to those of Jupiter in size and exactly equal them in number. The largest, Titan, is 3,000 miles in diameter and can be easily seen with the smallest telescopes. With a 4-inch telescope, 5 of the satellites can be readily found, though they are not as interesting to observe as the satellites of Jupiter because they are far more distant from the Earth. The time they require to make one journey around Saturn varies from nearly 23 hours for Mimas, the nearest, to approximately 524 days for Phoebe, the most distant. Saturn, as well as Jupiter, is marked by belts parallel to the equator, though they appear more indistinct than those of Jupiter on account of the greater distance of Saturn. Saturn also resembles Jupiter in its physical composition, which is largely, if not entirely, gaseous, and in the extremely short period of rotation on its axis, which is approximately 10 hours. In more ways than one, Saturn is a very unusual planet. In addition to possessing an enormous ring system, it is the lightest of all the planets, its density being only 63 hundredths that of water, and it is the most oblate, its flattening at the poles amounting nearly to 1/10 of its diameter. Its equator is more highly inclined to its orbit than is the case with any other planet, not even excepting the Earth and Mars. For this reason, its seasonal changes are very great, in marked contrast to Jupiter, whose equator lies very nearly in the plane of its orbit. Since Saturn is so far away from the Sun that it receives only 1/90th as much light and heat per unit area as the Earth, its outer gaseous surface must be extremely cold, unless considerable heat is conveyed to the surface from within its hot interior. The late Professor Lowell concluded from certain observations made at Flagstaff, Arizona, that Saturn is composed of layers of different densities, and that the inner layers are more flattened at the poles and rotate faster than the outer layers. Marked variations in the color and brightness of the ball of the planet have been noted from time to time. In 1916, observers of Saturn described the planet as pinkish-brown and conspicuously darker than the brighter portions of the rings. It is believed that these very noticeable changes in the color and brightness of Saturn are due to slight irregular changes in the intensity of the radiations of the Sun, which set up certain secondary effects in the atmosphere of the planets. Similar changes in color and brightness have been observed also in the case of Jupiter. Chapter 21. Is the Moon a Dead World? It has been a generally accepted belief among astronomers for years that the Moon is a dead world, devoid of air and water, and so necessarily lifeless. It is certain that the Moon has no extensive atmosphere such as envelops our own planet. There is abundant proof of this fact. The edge of the lunar disk is clear-cut. Whenever, as happens frequently, the Moon passes between us and a star, the disappearance of the star is instantaneous. There is no gradual dimming or refraction of the star's light by atmospheric vapors. Moreover, lunar shadows are harsh and black. There is no evidence of diffusion of light on the Moon by atmospheric gases. The absence of water or water vapor on the visible surface of the Moon, at least in any appreciable quantity, is plainly evident to anyone who observes the Moon through the telescope. Even with small telescopes, objects 5 miles or so in diameter can be readily detected, and clouds drifting over the surface could not possibly escape our observation if they existed. Bodies of water, great or small, would be plainly visible, and would besides give rise to water vapor and clouds which we would not fail to detect. Since the surface of the Moon is unscreened by air and water vapor to absorb the incoming rays from the Sun and the outgoing radiations from the surface, the extremes of temperature between day and night are very great, and are augmented by the fact that the lunar day equals the lunar month in length, so that 14 days of untempered heat are followed by 14 days of frigid darkness. Observation of the rate of radiation from the Moon's surface during total eclipses of the moon indicate that the moon's radiation is very rapid and that its temperature during the height of the lunar day probably approaches 200 degrees Fahrenheit, while at the lunar midnight it may have fallen to 100 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, or even lower. With air and water both lacking, and such extremes of temperature existing, why should we seriously consider the question of life on the moon? This is the point of view of the majority of astronomers, and it seems well taken. Yet many astronomers who have made a special study of the lunar surface for years, under all conditions of illumination and phase, and have most carefully observed and mapped and photographed its characteristic markings, are agreed that there are evidences that changes are taking place on the moon, and recently Professor W.H. Pickering has expressed the belief, substantiated by drawings, that there is a progressive change of color or darkening within certain lunar craters with the advance of the lunar day, indicating, in his opinion, a rapid vegetational growth that springs up in the height of the lunar day and dies out as the lunar night approaches. Some years ago, certain selenographers suggested that there might exist in the numberless crater pits and craters in the deep-lying maria or seas, and in the clefts and rills and cracks that form intricate systems all over the lunar surface, certain exhalations from the surface and heavy vapors, including possibly carbon dioxide and water vapor, to temper the extremes of the long lunar days and night, and furnish the necessary medium for the support of certain forms of animal and vegetable life. Many astronomers, including a number who are not in sympathy with the above view, believe that snow and ice exist on the moon, even though water in the form of liquid and vapor is not observable. All the extremely brilliant portions of the surface, according to some astronomers, are covered with snow and ice. Certainly, some portions of the moon's surface reflect sunlight as brilliantly as if they were covered with freshly fallen snow, while other portions appear to be black by contrast. There also appears to be evidence that certain small markings, described as crater cones, and resembling our terrestrial volcanoes more than any other lunar feature, are at times temporarily obscured from view by a veil of vapors. Many observers believe that these crater cones are active volcanic vents, and that there is considerable volcanic activity still taking place upon the moon. These small crater cones resemble, we are told, parasitic cones found on the sides of terrestrial volcanoes, and they are frequently seen on the floors of craters closely associated with light streaks. These crater cones appear under a high sun as minute white spots and can be studied to advantage only with powerful instruments. The Italian astronomer Maggini, observing the floor of the lunar crater Plato in 1916, noted that one of the small crater cones that exist there in great numbers was temporarily obscured from view by a cloud of reddish vapors. And Professor W.H. Pickering at Arequipa, Peru, observing the same region some years ago, believed that he saw evidence of change in some of these small markings. The crater Plato has probably been more carefully studied than any other portion of the lunar surface. It is 60 miles in diameter and may be seen even without a telescope as a dark, eye, not far from the northern edge of the moon. Its floor is one of the darkest objects in the moon, a dark steel gray in color, and there is no doubt that for some unknown reason, its dark hue deepens from the time the sun has an altitude of 20 degrees until after full moon. It has a brilliant white wall rising from 3,000 to 4,000 feet above its floor, crowned with several lofty peaks and intersected by a number of valleys and passes. The spots and faint light markings on the floor have been the object of much study with small or moderate-sized instruments, and at least 6 of them are known to be crater cones. Since they can only be studied to advantage with powerful instruments, and as such instruments are rarely used for a systematic study of lunar markings, it is difficult to settle the controversy as to whether they have changed in appearance or have been at any time obscured by vapors. Most lunar observing is done necessarily with smaller instruments, because the majority of astronomers appear to have accepted the view that the moon is a dead world, and those who are engaged in astronomical work with our greatest telescopes seem to feel that other fields of research will prove more fruitful. Possibly it is for this reason that we know so little about our nearest neighbor in space. There are at least as many unsolved problems confronting us on the moon as there are among the distant stars. And with that intriguing thought, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Astronomy for Young Folks by Isabel Martin Lewis. I never fail to be entertained by this book, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. If you'd like to read this charming book for yourself and see the photographs and illustrations, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, the best place to catch me is on Twitter at BoringBooksPod, or drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.